Chapter 3. Medieval Watchmen, Foragers and Horse Scouts. Eyes on the road ahead, the quiet art of knowing before striking. War in the Middle Ages wasn't like the coordinated campaigns of modern militaries, or even the disciplined marches of the Roman legions. It was messy, fragmented, hundreds of lords squabbling over land and title, dozens of dialects clashing on the battlefield, and barely a usable map among them. Yet amid that chaos, one thing remained clear to every war leader worth their salt. You couldn't fight what you couldn't see coming. That's where the scouts came in. There were no standing armies for most of the early medieval period, no full-time general staffs. Instead, armies were patched together from feudal levies, mercenary bands, and armored nobles who sometimes had more ego than strategy. These armies gathered for a campaign and then dispersed just as quickly. But regardless of their size or cohesion, each of these war bands understood a universal truth. Someone had to go first. Someone had to know the way. And so, medieval scouting was born, not as an institution, but as a necessity. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even always planned, but it was vital. Imagine a medieval warband setting out in spring, mud still thick from thaw, supplies limited, and the commander relying on vague descriptions like 2 days north, past the forked tree. That was the reality of logistics. There were no standardized roadways, no topographical maps. Communication relied on runners who might not return, or local villagers who might lie. So who made the first move? Usually, it was a handful of trusted men. These scouts might be hunters who knew the nearby woods like their own homes, messengers who had galloped from village to village, or footmen with a sharp sense of terrain and weather. They didn't carry banners or rank. They carried knowledge, sometimes in their heads, sometimes scratched onto parchment or carved into sticks with notches marking turns and landmarks. Scouts were expected to be invisible. Moving ahead of the army, often alone or in pairs, they watched for enemy movement, tested trails, looked for signs of ambush, and listened for distant horns or the faint ring of armor in the wind. Villagers might offer clues. Abandoned homes, burnt fields, or silent livestock all whispered warnings. It was a dangerous game. If captured, a scout wasn't treated as a prisoner of war. He was a spy. Execution was the common outcome. And yet they went anyway, because without them, the rest of the army might stumble blindly into death. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe fractured into competing kingdoms, but one group, the Franks, began to unify the pieces. Under leaders like Charles Martel and later Charlemagne, the Frankish Empire didn't just fight, it marched, and marched far. To do that, they had to see beyond the tree line. Charlemagne's armies in the 8th and 9th centuries moved through dense forests, across hostile rivers, and into unfamiliar lands. These campaigns stretched from Saxony to northern Italy and into parts of Spain. He couldn't rely on instinct alone, so he began organizing his scouts more formally, though not as a full institution yet. He drew them from loyal families along the borders. These were men who knew the land, the trails, and the local politics. They often traveled a day ahead of the army, acting as its eyes and ears. These scouts, while not professional soldiers in the modern sense, brought back intelligence in rough sketches, hand-carved maps, or detailed verbal reports. They'd note things like a marsh 2 miles past the last oak grove, or enemy fires spotted beyond the hill ridge. These weren't abstract reports. They were actionable intelligence. During the Saxon Wars, for example, Frankish scouts once returned with reports of enemy warriors massing in a forest glade. The terrain was too dense for a direct attack, but the scouts had found a narrow pass around the rear. Charlemagne split his force, flanked the enemy, and turned what could have been a trap into a rout. No major victory song mentions the scouts by name, but they set the conditions for the win. We often imagine scouts purely as forward observers, but in the medieval world, they had another essential duty: feeding the army. Armies couldn't carry months of provisions. There were no trucks, no pre-packed MREs, no logistics corps. Soldiers ate what they could find, or what the scouts could find for them. Enter the foragers. These weren't just gatherers. They were advanced recon units with a dual purpose. They moved into the countryside ahead of the main army, looking for granaries, herds, wells, or orchards. They might requisition supplies, politely if possible, by force if not. But in doing so, they also performed one of the most effective forms of reconnaissance. A well-kept village might mean enemy forces had just passed through. A burned field suggested a scorched earth retreat. A dry well might mean sabotage or poisoning. Everything meant something, and a good scout knew how to read it. During William the Conqueror's preparations for the Battle of Hastings, scouts were dispatched to find river fords and evaluate the defensibility of local villages. One team identified a shallow crossing on the Thames that allowed a flanking maneuver. It's easy to credit the knights for the battle's outcome, but that early intel gave William the advantage. Foraging wasn't just about food, it was about clues. By the time of the Crusades in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, European armies faced a whole new challenge. They were fighting in completely alien environments. Deserts replaced forests, stone cities replaced villages, and the locals didn't speak a word of French, German, or Latin. Traditional European scouting techniques no longer worked. Knights were often more a liability than an asset in this terrain. So commanders adapted quickly. They hired local guides, sometimes Christians, sometimes converts, sometimes mercenaries who didn't care who paid them. These scouts could identify mountain passes, read desert weather patterns, and guide columns away from known ambush sites. Of course, trust was always a gamble. Before the siege of Antioch in 1097, Bohemond of Taranto, one of the shrewdest leaders of the First Crusade, relied on Armenian scouts to identify a hidden postern gate in the city walls. That tiny weakness changed the entire outcome. Bohemond sent a small strike force through the gate at night. They opened the main doors from within, letting the Crusaders pour in. A siege that might have dragged on for months ended in a brutal but fast victory. Without scouts, that opportunity would have been invisible. As Europe filled with fortresses and castles, the role of the scout shifted again. It wasn't just about movement, it was about observation. Each castle was a node in a network. Scouts were posted on walls, in tower lookouts, or hidden in forest outposts. Their job was to observe and signal, early warning systems in an age without radios. Signal fires became the medieval telegraph. Watchmen lit beacons to pass messages across distances in hours rather than days. A single lit tower in Wales could alert 3 more down the valley, triggering a cascade that reached distant cities before the enemy even crested the ridge. False alarms were dangerous, but missed alarms were worse. In Marcher territories, those unstable borderlands between England and Wales, local scouts were often the only warning before a raid. Lords relied on men who knew every deer trail, stream, and rock formation. These scouts could shadow raiders for miles, sometimes slipping into enemy territory for weeks. They'd count banners, estimate troop sizes, and then disappear like smoke back to their own lines. Many of them weren't formally trained, but they were highly valued, and sometimes the only reason a castle had time to raise its drawbridge. By the 14th and 15th centuries, things were changing. Slowly, armies were becoming more professional. Mercenary companies were growing, and some nations, especially England and France, began experimenting with more structured units. That shift bled into scouting, too. The idea of a fast, lightly armored cavalry force started to emerge, not just to harass or chase, but to see. These units were nimble. They traveled light, scouted terrain, and sometimes carried bows or crossbows to engage at range. They were the spiritual ancestors of later hussars and dragoons. English longbowmen during the 100 Years' War weren't just deadly in battle. Some served in scout groups ahead of the army, riding to river crossings, mapping roads, and intercepting messengers. Their reports shaped entire battle plans. One chronicler even described how, before Agincourt, a detachment of English scouts returned with news of deep mudfields and thick underbrush, information that led the English to take a defensive position, which would later funnel the French cavalry into a disastrous kill zone. These scouts didn't fight the battle, but they made the victory possible. Medieval warfare wasn't organized. It was more often a symphony of disorder: mud, language barriers, shifting alliances, and overlapping commands. But through all that clamor moved a different kind of soldier. The scout didn't lead charges or give speeches. He crouched in the brush, followed a ridgeline, or questioned a farmer by a roadside. He brought clarity to the fog. He was the one who knew before anyone else. We rarely know their names. The chronicles mention the kings, the generals, the saints, and the traitors, but they forget the riders who moved ahead of the army by a day, crouched on cliffs and counted torches in the night. Yet every commander, every smart one, knew that battles weren't won on the field alone. They were won in the hours before, when someone already knew where the enemy was. That quiet legacy, moving first, watching in silence, guiding the storm, would shape the future of military reconnaissance for centuries to come.